You want to see one of the coolest cheap Chinese amplifiers on the market today? This is the Douk H7. A little bit of a different take on a great amp chip. So sit down, grab a cup of coffee, and let's talk about the Douk H7. Cheap Chinese Class D amplifiers have come a long way. They were okay a while ago. And then, I don't know if it was AIMA, they did it first, I don't know. They started using the Texas Instruments 3255 amp chipset. Now, Texas Instruments has some other amp chipsets as well, and they're pretty good. The one unique thing about the 3255 is you can upgrade the power supply or increase the voltage of the power supply to a 48 volt 10 amp power supply, because a lot of these Class D amps from China, they claim crazy power numbers. 300 watts into 4 ohms or what have you. The thing about it is, though, they don't provide you with a power supply that actually is going to get you anywhere close to those numbers, and they're probably going to be 10% total harmonic distortion numbers anyway, which isn't really all that usable. In all honesty, you probably don't need more than 20 to 50 watts anyway, or you're probably not using 20 to 50 watts normally. Now, if you get a big bass hit, yes, you may need a little bit of power for a little bit of time. Actually, you might need a lot of power for a little bit of time. But the one thing that held back most of these amplifiers was simply the amount of power. The cool thing about the 3255, though, is that is not an issue. And more respected, more maybe mature companies like Topping, they use the 3255 and the PA5, which is a great amplifier. Now, it's been known to have a few reliability issues, but you cannot argue with that thing sonically. It sounds great. Enough about all that, though. Let's talk about the Douk H7. On the front, you may notice this cool color. Douk Audio has done a really good job about their build quality lately. This thing is built very well. So on the front of this, you have kind of a hi-fi Zen look where it's not symmetrical on the side, so it kind of curves right here. Maybe they ripped off that from hi-fi. I don't know. The Zen series kind of looks like this, a little bit different though. This is a bit of a lip on the front, so it kind of protrudes a little way, a little bit wider, a little bit taller than the rest of the unit. But on the front, the star of the show here is that UV meter. And there's a sensitivity knob for the VU meter. So if you're not getting it to jump up as much as you want to, you can kind of turn this up or down. This really probably isn't good for anything other than being entertained. And it's quite entertaining. I like the way it looks. I love VU meters. And I think the orange on gray, kind of cool. It's kind of like a portal looking thing. This thing is very different from most Class D amps because there are 2 volume controls, one for each channel. It'd be kind of weird if they were 2 volume controls for both channels, which means if your left speaker is off in kind of an open area of your room and your center imaging isn't great, this can be used fundamentally as a bit of a balance knob. It is kind of weird though, because if you don't need differences in the balance, if you don't need your right speaker to be a little bit louder than your left speaker, then you have to kind of turn them up the same rate. And there's no guarantee that these pots are in exactly the same spot. So one may be a little bit higher than the other, even to get an even volume control. But regardless, this was very useful even in my office. My left speaker needs a little bit more juice to get that center image locked on. And then over here you have XLR or RCA selector, and then it turns it on too. Good gravy. There's a little bit of power left in here. That's interesting. So, what's on the back? On the back, XLR inputs right here. RCA inputs right here. RCA outputs right here. Speaker posts right here. And then you have your power input. Again, 24 volts all the way up to 48 volts. It comes with a 32 volt 5 amp power supply. which means that's going to be enough power. Oops. That's going to be enough power. I just hit the keyboard. That's going to be enough power for most applications. 32 times 5 is 160 watts. So that's going to be enough for most people. A lot of these amps, not these specifically, but a lot of the Class D Chinese amps come with 24 volt power supplies. So you are getting a bit more juice. And I have found that the 32 volt 5 amp is kind of the Goldilocks zone. It's more than the 24, obviously, not as much as the 48, but it gives me enough power that I don't really feel like I need a bigger, beefier power supply. If your speakers are really low when it comes to efficiency, you may want to look at upgrading the power supply, but I think for most people, the 32 volt is going to be just fine. This amp is a little bit different than most cheap Chinese amplifiers, Class D amplifiers. That sounds so negative, but it's really not negative. They're quite good. This one's a little bit different because it does have balanced and single-ended inputs. So it has fundamentally 2 inputs. And I use the balanced inputs a lot, not necessarily because of any sonic improvements, but simply because it's convenient and I like XLR cables, cords, because they don't, I don't know, they just seem to lay better. I use the Shelly Labs J2, which has balanced outputs right into the H7 from Douk Audio. And then I also ran the Fozzy Audio, it's their phono preamp, into the single-ended. With only 2 inputs, this has me covered because most of my music listening is done digitally. And the J2, which is incidentally one of the best DACs you can get, under $1,000, does all of the digital switching for me. And usually I only have 2 inputs. So I'll have a coax from my CD player, usually, and then a digital optical from my Weem Pro. That's a long way to say that this is probably going to be enough for most people, even though it's only 2 inputs. Let's talk about how it sounds. Not all amps with the 3255 chipset sound the same. Actually, it would be kind of weird if they did, because there is still some design characteristics, I think mostly to do with the power supply, that can definitely impact the sonics of this amp. I would say the thing that stood out to me the most on the H7 is just how much bass presence there was. There was so much bass that I actually had to look at the EQ on the Weem Pro to make sure that I didn't have an EQ running. And it wasn't. It was flat. I also didn't have an EQ in the chain at all. The speakers that I was using is the ELAC BS41, which is a small 4-inch driver. Very inefficient speaker, but this thing was slapping me like a salmon at the fish market in Seattle. You ever been there? I have. Never been slapped by a salmon though. Point being is this thing really punches hard, and it reminds me of the PA5 from Topping. Very pleased with the amount of bass coming from this. As far as mid-range clarity, I feel like it's not as clean as some of the other amps that use the same chipset. A07, even with its stock op amps, seems to be a little bit cleaner through the mid-range, but it doesn't punch quite as hard. On the top end, I also felt like it was a little bit forward in the 3K, 4K, was a titch sibilant. That can be EQ'd out though, and I did that with the Weem Pro. I know it wasn't the DAC, because the J2 AKM version is not sibilant at all. And I know it wasn't the speakers, because the BS41s, if anything, are a bit roll off on top. So this amp is probably going to be somewhat picky about the speakers that you pair with it. And I think that the BS41s are probably about as good of a pairing as you can get. And it's also cheap. How much is this? It's about 130 bucks. $130. So I thought the ELAC was a good speaker to test with it. Another good speaker that you could put with it is the Sony SSCS5s. However, with that pop in the treble, you may want to consider EQ on that as well. You may want to consider EQ, period. But as a whole, this thing sounds better than I think it should sound, especially with the amount of bass. It sounds like a really powerful amplifier. And in a sense, it is a powerful amplifier, but the star of the show on this amp is all about the punch. I think Douk Audio is really up in their game. The build quality on some of these Douk Audio products is getting really good. Really good. I mean, this is on par with the iFi Zen products. if not better. I think the knobs are better. This has a kind of indented volume control, both sides. Sensitivity is also got the little clicks on it. RCA, the input selector, very satisfying. Doesn't feel cheap at all. These knobs are metal and knurled. Very good. I'm very impressed with Douk Audio. And I think they really have something with this design. Just did a review on their EQ right here. I think if they get an EQ that has the same design characteristics as this amp, and it kind of is matchy-matchy, I think that's a heck of a combination. Now the EQ, I loved it, wasn't perfect. I wish that one of the frequencies was 2K rather than 1K. But it's still a really good, affordable EQ. These products are not perfect, but they are moving in the right direction. And I think if Douk could come out with a whole line that kind of has the same styling characteristic, and you can start building a bit of a stack, especially with the EQ, especially with the amp. This isn't going to be for everybody though, because it does have the 2 volume controls. I think if you had another unit that had 1 volume control, same styling, I think you got a winner. I think this is a winner, but it's not going to be a winner for everybody because of the 2 volume controls. With the RCA out, you could use this as a preamp of sorts. I'm not exactly sure why you would want to do that, but you could. But you can also hook up a subwoofer with the RCA outs. Could easily be a 2.1. Doesn't have a DAC. And I'm glad it doesn't, because I think if Douk starts to move into the separates category and has some cohesiveness in a line, I think this, or maybe another version of this with 1 volume control, could really anchor it. I don't know if you can bridge the 3255 amp chipset. Maybe you can, but if you could bridge it, then something like this could become a mono block, and then you could add 2 of them. Really, really, really impressed with this thing. Not going to be perfect for everybody in every situation, but I think this is a winner. Little bit of mid-range muddiness, little bit of top-end harshness, but if we look back at where Class D was 18 months ago, this is a huge leap forward in sonic improvements. I think the Fuzzy Audio TB10D sounds a little bit more balanced, but definitely doesn't have the bottom end punch that the H7 does. Really impressed. Not perfect, but hardly anything is perfect. So if you want to support the channel, you can sign up for Patreon. Patreon.com/cheapaudioman. Every Sunday night we have Patreon-only Zooms. We also have a Patreon-only Discord, Patreon-only Facebook group. You can also use the links to buy the H7. That will be an affiliate link, which means if you click and you buy, I do get a commission, but it doesn't cost you any more. So it's a great way to support the channel. You can also... almost grabbed an old cup of coffee. You can also use the thanks button down at the bottom of the video next to the share button. Buy me a cup of coffee, but don't feel compelled to buy me anything. So don't binge watch anything on Netflix or Hulu. Binge listen, maybe through your new Douk Audio H7, and fill your soul with happiness. And with that, I'm Randy. I'm the Cheap Audio Man.